start just with kind of a holistic view of urban tree growing. And then we're going to go for a walk and look at some examples of trees and talk about foraging seed from public trees.
I learned about propagation mostly just by observing things in their natural environment and playing around with stuff, and Ryan's given me lots of good advice as well.
I've brought some resources, some references here that you can lean on as well. They've been really helpful for me to get better results right from the get-go. The internet's a pretty good resource, but it can be pretty wildly variable, and they can start recommending, like, mashing an avocado and planting it, just pseudoscience randomness. We're just sticking with the standards here today. Experimentation is what it's all about, though, so if you find something that works for you, stick with it. That's the key. That's kind of how I found my way as an arbutus grower. I found a system that works. It's not really in any books, but I get a high return out of it, so I'm sticking with it. So with that out of the way, this is going to be two parts. One, we're looking at public trees today and actually collecting seed to grow at home, but ultimately want to find places for our trees to end up, that isn't a container. So that's a key takeaway from this. We need to think together as community members on how to get trees planted. We can grow them easily enough, but how do we get them distributed and established? One of the discussions we were having before we got started was how removals list went out for city trees, public trees, and a good portion of those trees being removed this fall are young trees. Trees that have just been planted out are not surviving when they establish. And we'll talk about reasons that may be happening. One of them, of course, climate change, global heating, increasing temperatures, increasing periods of drought, more hydrophobic soils, and also urban development as well, kind of creating a double whammy and making growing space harder and harder to come by. So we can grow trees all day long, but if we're not addressing the growing conditions we're sticking them into, we're not going to get great results ultimately. What we're going to be dealing with here mostly today is growing using containers. This is all going to be inexpensive materials you can find, salvage, reuse, repurpose. Pretty much the only stuff I went out and bought today were for my own growing purposes, because I am a commercial grower of arbutus. I'm also a non-profit grower of Garry Oak through the Garry Oak Meadow Preservation Society. So those supplies I'll use for myself because I cycle through a lot of them, but the rest of the stuff I brought here are just salvaged containers. I picked up a bulk load of soil this morning in my pickup, so we've avoided plastic in that capacity. And the good news is, if you want to take home a container with you today with seed that you collected during this workshop, I'm happy to provide that for you. And we'll wrap up our workshop up top by my truck, where we'll go through the whole potting process with the seed you gathered, and hopefully you'll get a tree out of it that you can someday plant out in the open. Trees that have well-established root systems are from seed collected from trees in good health. The chances of your trees being accepted by the municipality are much better. And that's the level of detail we're going to look at today. I'm showing you some container technology where we can get better root systems, where they're more likely to welcome them. First thing you're going to need as an urban tree seed forager is a good pair of cargo pants. Wear them every single day, because you never know where you're going to be and see the seed you need from the tree you want. In general, being in the City of Victoria, I'll say you have a really good resource in the City of Victoria's Vic map. They have a parks layer where you can select tree species, and boom, it populates all 33,000 public-owned trees. You can then sort through those trees to individual species or individual size and narrow your search to a park, for example. I've chose Banfield because it's got, it doesn't have the greatest collection of trees, but it's It's got good, accessible, low branches on many of the trees, and several local species to choose from, arbutus and Garry Oak in particular, which I'm most fond of and probably most connected with in terms of producing the quality of trees that the municipality is likely to plant. So we can actually collect some. I've rummaged around and I see seed is abundant. That's sort of the key. We will talk about the ethics of collecting seed from public trees, and if the crop is minimal and if it's of a local species that wildlife depends on, maybe we're collecting less or not at all. Also, if it means we're venturing off trail and into areas with sensitive plants, areas that have been recently restored, we're going to avoid that sort of activity. We're just collecting what's out and available, generally is on the ground. When I went to look at the arbutus over here that I gathered some seed from, the birds are already going at it and they're pretty wasteful. So you can find more than enough on the ground that is nice and ripe. Sometimes you want to engage in a little bit of stealth. People see you taking seed from a tree, they might get the wrong idea. So just pick your moment. Generally, if you're picking off the ground, people don't tend to care. Before we get to that, I'll explain what some of the stuff I have laid out here is. Laura's been kind enough to bring some of her own seed. She's got a good system now for shore pine, Pinus contorta contorta, and black hawthorn, Crataegus douglasii. We've got some seed from black hawthorn and June plum. Here you can see she's already started the process to separate the seed from the cone on those shore pine. And Laura's already grabbed some arbutus seed for me, in addition to the stuff that I just collected. I brought a couple of acorns with me. We should have enough. Yeah, it was a pretty good year for acorn crop this year. It's been the talk of the town, really. I mean, even if they're pre-ripe, they tend to ripen pretty quickly once they separate from the caps and germinate just fine. I would say the earliest you would want to be collecting is late August. And if they're left on the ground, they'll get predated by rodents pretty fast from here on out. So now's a good time to gather before they get chewed up. I've also got some Pacific dogwood here from a really nice tree, an urban tree that I found in town. And here's a Kusa or Chinese dogwood. Very different looking fruit than the Pacific. And I've got some black hawthorn here as well. So just because everything I have here is native or local to the area, that doesn't mean I'm totally against introduced species. Well, I do have one introduced species right here, Cornus Kusa. Especially when we're talking about street trees in very urbanized areas, some introduced trees are going to establish and provide benefits that native species aren't really effective at. So I've dabbled with quite a number of introduced species as well and can speak to those as we go if you have any questions about it. Just so happens that's what we've brought out today. Now let's talk about root systems. The challenge with growing in containers is tree roots want to grow quite rapidly outwards to anchor, access water and nutrients, and so on. Well, when we establish them in containers, we can run into a lot of interference. They hit the side of the container, they direct downwards, inwards, upwards. And what do you think the issue might be over time if we were to plant that tree that has got all these curls in the roots and changes in directions?
Strangle itself or something?
Yeah, so it can actually restrict the flow of photosynthates, water, nutrients exchanging, and actually cut that off entirely and you'll have dieback occur. That's one of the reasons.
If it doesn't reach out as far, then it's more likely to tip over in a storm.
Yeah. It's also, we lose wood strength where you have a total change in direction as well. You could have a combination of that wounding occurring from the girdling introduces decay at that point. Often when we see these large tree failures occur, it will be as a result of root defects that weren't treated at the time of planting, or from poor quality nursery stock in general. So this is one of the reasons I brought certain containers with me today, is to avoid precisely this. Garry oaks do not grow well in small containers, is the long and short of it. They need soil volume. They are a tap-rooted tree. They like to get anchored quite quickly. Garry oak is actually one species where if you provide good protection from rodents, it may be the best strategy of all to actually direct sow the acorn into the ground for the strongest anchorage and the most rapid growth. They generally just fall from the tree, land on their side, and will produce a root radical right from that. As long as there's a little bit of shade over the acorn, it doesn't, you could sprinkle a little bit of soil on top of it just to protect it from the sun, but no more than that. It doesn't need to be shoved down into the soil. Here's an example of a young tree planted straight from the nursery, a street tree from an unnamed municipality that was removed, obviously at a very young age, and we can see girdling roots. We can see roots growing almost directly downward. We see no roots almost on one whole side of the tree, and this is in large part due to the growing culture. So whatever system they are growing into is producing these root defects. So it's important as we're getting into growing trees that we're always observing the root systems that we're producing. So if you pull the plant out, I'll demonstrate on this dogwood here. If you draw the plant out, shake out the soil, observe the roots, because you may not be growing in the ideal setup for that tree. We want our trees to thrive when they're planted ultimately. So it may mean switching up your containers and revising the process as you go.
People want to know what to expect, like have a straight trunk and certain characteristics, like often it's like no fruit, to have no mess, but really for us to be resilient for climate change, I think we need that genetic diversity that you get from seed-grown trees. So for me, that's part of my inspiration to try to learn how to grow trees from seed.
So I've got two different pots that are both 1 gallon. One is called an air pruning pot. You'll note that there are tiny holes in these dimples, and the bottom of it is porous. And notice the little root tips that have come out the bottom, how small they are. So this is what I'm growing many of the trees I'm working with now. What is occurring is the roots reach the edge of the pot and they find these holes at the outside of the pot and they stop growing. Basically the root tip's exposed, so the plant diverts energy elsewhere. Same happens in the bottom of the pot because this is suspended up off of the ground. It encounters air and stops growing and distributes energy elsewhere. So we get less wood forming on the roots, we get more density in the fibrous root system, and a better chance of success ultimately when we go to establish the tree. So I'm just going to tease apart the soil here and we'll see what we see as far as the root system. And then I will do the same with the traditional 1 gallon solid container.
Wouldn't that dry out super fast with all those holes? You gotta water.
It dries out faster. That's a good point. So you need to adjust your watering. So I don't have any circling roots. I'm playing around with it here and everything is growing outward or downward. Now, same species. Ooh, this is gonna be funny. I can feel it already.
What was that, Ryan?
Beat it, Laura.
You're the morning glory, probably.
Yeah. So you can see it's just a big corkscrew. It's one solid root working its way downward, and well, that one just fell apart, but so a little bit of density, but this is not a root system we want to plant out. Whereas this, we've got lots of density, which is important. Those fine roots are, we don't need a lot of structure right now. What we need is water and nutrient uptake, and those fine roots will find their way radially outward in quicker time than this. This may, you know, it may establish and make it to a point in its life where it is exposed to winds, and then the overall strength of the structure is overcome by a snow load or a wind load, and it fails at that point because it doesn't have that outward root spread. You can correct it to an extent. So you would effectively find a point where you're, you know, we've got some lateral growth to reduce to, but we don't want inward growth. There's not a lot of options here to choose from, right? Now we don't have a lot of root system left, so will it make it or not? We'll see. Sometimes it will. This is usually the point where I will take it from the solid container and switch it over to the air pruning style container, and it might do okay. These are the dangers of growing in containers with a very vigorous species like Garry Oak. Vigorous root system, we don't think of Garry Oak as fast growing, but its root system sure is. Like the acorns that are on the ground right now, by this time in mid-January, the taproot will be 45 centimeters in the ground, and you will not be able to transplant it successfully. We're looking for all-out drought tolerance and adaptability to climate change, then growing from seed direct sow into the ground is going to be the best way to get a long-lived tree that is structurally strong and free of root defects. Container culture, I can't give the same guarantee.
Are you running into a similar problem with growing arbutus? I'm told they're very hard to transplant from a pot to full soil. Is it because of the root system?
They're very sensitive to transplant shock. The root system is very different on an arbutus though. It's much more fibrous than woody, like you would see with the Garry Oak. Ideally, you're transplanting arbutus in 2 to 3 years. Longer than that, and they start to get woody and get really temperamental going from the pot into the ground. And you can also run into some root system defects that way as well.
I have a baby from Ryan, you know, that was probably in a 1 gallon, and now it's taller than me, and it's just been the first few years was, you know, keeping it watered in the drought of the summer, which you might think it doesn't need because they are drought tolerant when they're older, but a lot of times, yeah, they need that babying when they're young.
An arbutus in a 1 gallon is taller than you?
Yeah, I think I planted in 2019 even, so yeah.
That's pretty much, I distribute all my arbutus in 1 gallon and recommend they get planted out basically within a year of turning them over to the distributor. The root systems have minimal defects, even more improvement in the air pruning 1 gallon, which, where did that end up?
I've got one right now, it's about that high. I'd like to donate it.
Yeah, so I'm growing the arbutus in these now, and minimal root system defects, easy to take the container apart, put it right in the ground, and away it goes. And yeah, they can, after their first year, generally they can be growing about 1 meter a year with adequate watering, and they're also ultra drought tolerant, but provide us with that year-round leaf cover, so we get the rainwater disruption benefits in the winter. Important to think about as we're getting these wild rainfall events in the winter months now. Big leaf maples, they'll just explode on disturbed sites, and it's the easiest thing in the world to collect them. They just tease right out of the ground and you pot them right up. That's another method of propagation. Another strategy, certain native species that you can use is called live staking, and also layering. I think Laura's got a layering example here, but here we get to look at another solid 1 gallon container. This is red osier dogwood. This is vegetative reproduction using hardwood cuttings collected in autumn, late autumn. And pretty nice root system for a 1 gallon container, but they don't get the woody roots initially like Garry Oak do. Cornus stolonifera, red osier dogwood. So this is me taking a vertical shoot, probably about a pencil thick shoot like that. Take my stealth approach and snip in an area that, maybe getting into the pathway.
Cut it like about there, you mean? Like
No, I've been taking them about that thickness. You'd probably be just fine there as well. The shoots need to be hardwood, so if they're still soft, still emerging sort of in the second flush in late summer, I wouldn't attempt live staking. So about this size, I would cut from that point, remove the lower shoots, stick it in growing medium, put it in the shade, and give it water. Ideally, late autumn, early winter, you're going to have best results with hardwood cuttings for this specific species.
And you leave it outside then
I do.
and water it all winter?
If we have a droughty winter, then yeah. I don't want it to ever dry out, but I don't want it to be soaking wet either. Mind you, osier dogwood probably wouldn't care, but very easy to grow.
And then it layers itself, so if you have a branch coming off your main shrub, and then wherever it touches the ground, from a node it just sends down roots. So I don't have space for all the babies that mine wants to make, which a bird probably planted. So I kind of keep an eye on those branches that are low to the ground. I just tug them, and then when I find them rooted, I dig them up and pot them up. And there's quite a few here for whoever wants them.
Ooh.
So,
And these are a shrub, not a tree.
yeah, so this is red twig dogwood. That's
Large shrub, small tree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe 10 feet tall, maybe even bigger sometimes. What would you say, 15?
Well, around wetlands, they can get
Yeah.
pretty wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it naturally grows where it's usually pretty wet, but it also can handle quite a bit of drought, it seems.
Provides nice cover and branching, and just cover for a lot of smaller birds. And the berries, they seem to appreciate fall color. It's pretty outstanding. For cuttings in general, there's not too much going on here that I'm gonna cover, but this little book is great, and I'm not sure where to find it at local bookstores. I got it through a propagation workshop I took a long time ago, and I refer back to it all the time. It goes month by month, and all the late season stuff, I refer back to it, and then I'll go out on a mission and gather some cuttings. And they go into growing media. When I say growing media, I use different media for different situations based on experimentation mainly. When I say softwood, it's those shoots, well, they're still kind of green and pliable. And hardwood, they've hardened off and are quite sturdy. So that's another method of propagation, just generally better with shrubs. However, cottonwood, alder, and I think even Oregon ash do quite well with the live staking approach if the timing is right. Cottonwood is a piece of cake. Scholar willow, Pacific willow, they do quite well, and they're not readily available at nurseries as well, so that can be really good and helpful for like a watershed group. The focus on carbon, I think, for the urban context has been sort of put to rest at this point. The other benefits that trees provide, public health benefits, benefits that would require gray infrastructure to replace them, those pack a lot more punch for the cities than just pure carbon storage, carbon sequestration. Forest trees, different story. Within the inner city, we just don't have the power of the numbers to achieve that carbon sink. That said, some species are capable of packing on a lot more carbon and doing it quicker than others. So we've covered a few different methods of propagation. I think we should probably go for a little walk and look at some different trees and talk about actual seed picking. The female deposits eggs in a tiny hole that like seals itself earlier on in the season. and the larvae start to form inside, and they start to feed on the inside of the acorn as it develops. And it will not be viable ultimately. Sometimes you can catch on this one, they've already emerged. When you see the larger hole on the outside, the larvae have emerged out of the acorn and have exited.
So then you want to pick one that's not cracked already?
That is not cracked. Oh, you already got radical forming on that one. Boo!
So
yeah,
you would plant that whole thing in the soil, or what's?
the root tip you can see is drying out.
Okay, yeah.
It's not great. It's been so dry. I'm not surprised that's happening. Ideally, you would see a nice, clean, greenish, whitish tip of that root when it starts to emerge, and that'll be one that we can direct sow, or we can pot up. But ideally, again, we're going to want a larger container and one that's air pruning for best case scenario.
When do you plant down?
So if you hold the acorn up, one has kind of a pointy tip on it and the other has a flat side. The pointy tip is where the root radical will emerge from. So roots pointed down or sideways, it seems to always find its way. You know, it's not going to land the perfect way as it falls from the tree every time, and yet they seem to establish quite well. But yeah, I generally just point the root tip down when I'm potting them up. Now, I will take all these acorns back that I've done the initial visual on. No cracks, no weevil signs, no chewing from squirrels or rats, and do a float test. I just put them in some water, and the ones that float to the surface are not viable. The ones that are, I will leave them to soak for a little bit, then drain them, put them in a bag, put them in the fridge, and wait for these root tips to begin to emerge from them. Some will start right away, some won't pop until December or January even.
So it could be months, could be days.
Yep, but generally I don't start potting these up until December. I let it cool down a bit and get into the rainier months before I start potting up oaks. If it is freezing, I try and avoid sticking them out ahead of a cold snap type of thing. I'll just leave them in the fridge a little bit longer and give it a week. Skip the fridge and direct sow as well will work, but you're going to need to water this time of year because it's been so dry.
You say leave them in soaking for a bit. Oh, is that like
5 minutes to 24 hours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and the 24-hour soak has the added benefit of if you missed any larvae, they'll mine their way out and drown, basically. We've gathered some seed here, but it's important before we do that, we have a good look at the tree and see that it ticks a couple of boxes as far as the health, mainly the health, before we go reproducing from that genetic population. The other thing is if we're trying to grow trees of local species, it's better to find older trees because we'll have a better chance that the tree is actually of local genetic population rather than being introduced from an off-island nursery, which is probably the most common practice of planting new Garry Oaks. Most of the nursery production happening now for Garry Oaks is off-island and out of the country in some cases as well. Doing a health check on the tree, we've identified it's probably from the local genetic population, which is a big thumbs up. Now, if I'm looking at an introduced species, obviously it's not the local population, but I would be looking for attributes that it is going to thrive in the type of situation where I want to plant in. So I'll collect from trees that are in similar growing conditions where I ultimately have in mind, because I know it tends to perform well in that case, and those would be the introduced trees that I would gather seed from. So if I'm considering the health of the tree, what do you think I would be looking at?
Root flare?
Root flare? Yeah. Yep. I think that would be a good indication of good genetics, and it could be site specific in that capacity. Yeah, I see a nice pronounced transition from the trunk into the roots. Strong, sturdy tree. Leaf density, also leaf color, leaf size, leaf distribution. You can look around at other trees. In this case, there are other Garry Oaks around us. We can see what the rest of the population looks like. Maybe this tree is stressed and the others are looking a little bit better. This tree's not too bad. Would I grow trees from this oak? I think so. Let's go look at another tree. Birds are going to town on the arbutus berries as they start to ripen, and they are messy. So you can find everything you need without actually getting into the tree or reaching for the low branches. Generally, it's better just to leave them for the birds and collect, right off of the trail or off of the ground. Arbutus is another one where I can think of plenty of examples where they are exceptional urban trees and adaptable, but there are some major weaknesses in the population's ability to reproduce itself. Deer love grazing on tender young shoots of arbutus, which a new seedling establishing can be a death sentence for it. Invasive species pressures covering over the ground and around existing stands of arbutus. It doesn't give any ground space basically for those trees to even establish in the first place. Urban trees, I think, similar to Garry Oak, people find the litter to be a bit much and have negative associations with it. And I would just counter with that. If you're in a city like Victoria, Oak Bay, Esquimalt, Saanich, where you have leaf pickup already, that's a service that is turning that leaf litter into an important product that the community now has access to. They're taking care of that composting process and offering it out to the community, which is a great product for your own efforts in restoration on public property, but also if you're fortunate enough to have property of your own where you can garden, then you have access to that product. It's the only native broadleaf evergreen which provides us that dense leaf area, which is going to be important for disrupting rainfall and slowing erosion and runoff, especially if we're thinking about watersheds and all the contaminants that quickly wash away into fish-bearing habitat. These are important trees to slow that rainfall, and incorporating them into watersheds is pretty useful. Orange to red is what I look for. Here's a good example right here. They can get even deeper red than that. When they start to get real squishy, that's when I like them best. So I just bursted one of the berries here. You can see the tiny seeds. Some of the larger, you get the real fat berries. They'll have up to 20 seeds I've seen in them. Tiny little black seeds. What I do, I take them home, burst all the berries, wash them in like a sieve, and then I put them in stratification. So I have a Ziploc bag. I brought a bunch of Ziploc bags for me, so if you want to collect some arbutus, you can grow your own arbutus today. So I wash them all off and I put them, I don't remove the flesh on the outside or anything. I just throw them in burst like that into the bag with vermiculite. I use an inert growing medium, so you could use sand, you could use perlite or vermiculite, and just moist, not soaking wet, and just mix it all together, put it in the fridge. From the time I collect right about now to the time that they are sprouting is very fast. I could expect these to be bursting. They usually start right around January 1st. So it's a quick turnaround. Garry Oaks as well, very quick from collection to germination.
Are you in the fridge the whole time when they're sprouting?
They sprout in the fridge, yep. And then as soon as they're sprouting en masse, I will remove them and start putting them into trays. And I keep them indoors under grow lights with just a crude humidity tent around it until we're past, we've been getting these late February snowstorms and cold snaps. I usually wait for the beginning of March and then they go outside. they're pretty notoriously difficult, and I found something that worked, and it sort of, I schedule around it now. I kind of look forward to the steps based on the process that I've worked with. One thing I will say, if you are going to experiment, is hedge your bets, because you get one chance to do it per year. So I go from stratification Ziploc bag to in the lights, I go into like a, what is it, 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch by 4 inch depth pot, where I'll have maybe 3 or 4 per pot, and just fill them that way. And then in March, I will remove them and grow them in individuals, either in 1 gallon or individual in those 3.5 by 3.5 by 4 pots. So yeah, somebody brought up the transition of pots and making too big of a jump from one to the other. That can be game over. So it's better to go gradual in general, with the exception of some species where you should just start in a really big pot. Nut growing trees, nut producing trees, I mean, oaks especially, they seem to like that soil volume better. The issue with the larger pot is water seems to migrate out to the end of the pot rather than getting down the middle of it. So the plants just run out of water, or don't access to the water, and desiccate. So looking at the health check with this arbutus, yeah, it's a little dodgy. You know, I might have second thoughts about this, but is it a result of stress that's come through development? There's like a sewer access hole right there. I think we're on a CRD main right where we are. There's a lot of foot traffic, a lot of people hanging out in the summer, so a lot of disturbance around it. It's quite a hot spot. Or is it a genetic issue potentially? I'm kind of bouncing these questions around, and if I have other arbutus to look at around it, definitely looking to them for cues to see if it's just, you know, maybe this tree is in decline. It is quite old though, so it's made it quite a long time. If it had any genetic deficiencies, if it was particularly susceptible to a pathogen like canker, this is a canker pattern we see here, which seems to be staying just ahead of the formation of wood. Is that a result of stress in recent years, or has it been present for a long period of time? You have to ask these questions of yourself. But it is quite large.
It's kind of a weird base.
Yeah, it's got a really good, it's kind of a big swelling here. There's some decay in behind it, I guess. But, you know, ask those questions of yourself. If you see a really striking arbutus, keep in mind that's the baseline, and compare other trees to that as you move forward, and, you know, look for the best case scenario you can find. I think is a good strategy. Just quickly, we'll move over here to these couple of oaks that have been planted. I'm just trying to see what the nursery was. The other ones I found are from Specimen Tree, and that is a nursery based on the Lower Mainland. No idea where they get their seed from to produce oaks, but it's probably not from the island, South Island genetic population. Just something to keep in mind. Does anybody know what this is for?
Deer?
Yeah, a lot of trees are lost to deer every year unnecessarily. This is a very simple precaution you can take. They generally won't mess with it, even if it's loosely formed like this. It's a little bit better if you can stake it. Just gives it a bit of rigidity. Sometimes you'll get bucks basically in the fall on the rut, and they just want to tangle their antlers and everything and beat it to death and break it. But the stakes do give you a bit more, they'll last a little longer against the deer assault. But without it, yeah, you're just setting yourself up for heartbreak if you're trying to plant trees out. They will pull off all the foliage, and the tree is, you know, too vulnerable at that stage, and it will probably die. If you need access to fencing, it is around. You can get it in small amounts from some of the local hardware stores. Like, you don't have to commit to a whole roll. If you reach out to the community, often people will have leftovers lying around. Like, try and salvage and reuse whatever you can find. But do install. Like, I will not give people arbutus without their assurance that they're providing deer protection, because it's a waste of everybody's time. One of the challenges is, as an urban forest planner in cities now, is they're running out of spaces to plant that are really easy to switch on and open up. You notice out in the open, there's other user groups in the park. They can get bent out of shape in a hurry if you drop a tree in situ, and it can be distant from a sports field, but they just don't feel engaged and can push back in a hurry. So city urban foresters are looking to the last remaining places that are easy to just like get somebody in there and plant a tree quickly. And it's more and more we're seeing areas like this where you're encroaching on existing trees. They're off the beaten path and not necessarily where people can really benefit from them. But cities have a hard time engaging. It uses up a lot of time to engage with the public, right? To do it right anyways. So they may be reluctant to do that. But the expectation is that they continue to plant trees in increasing numbers. They don't have access to private property, so they're gonna, more and more, we're gonna see them planting in places that are less than ideal. And this is one of the ways we can speak up as community members and say, no, we need to get trees like at the street where most of the pavement is, in parks where, people can benefit from them in open spaces. And it's gonna mean they're gonna have to do some work to open up to those other user groups that may be initially reluctant to welcome those trees. I wouldn't recommend breaking ground in the city, in city parks or natural areas at any point. If it's a disturbed area or you're like with a salvage group where you've gotten the blessing of the owner and that area is going to be cleared for whatever reason, then fill your boots. But the city has a whole process it has to go through just to be able to break ground, and they have major safety concerns. It's like a nice cluster over here, all within reach. When you go to break away the seed, if you're yanking on it too hard, you're doing it wrong. Often if you just twist in a direction, it'll freely pop off nice and easy. We want to cause as little injury as possible if we're drawing straight from the tree. Generally, these are looking a little bit dry, but I expect some of them will be viable. Ideally, we would have been picking seed from the maples 2 to 3 weeks ago. Well, this is white poplar, Populus alba. We haven't really talked about invasive attributes of trees, and this is one of them, where the germination rate, like they don't seem to be bothered by any of the pressures around. We need to be mindful when we're drawing seed from trees. There are some that don't need to be reproduced by us. Quite the opposite. Nice lush green tissue inside. So those will be ones I will take back. Now how I'm going to grow these would be similar to the arbutus, where I'll wash the seed. I'll warn you in advance with big leaf maple, they've got these fine fibrous tissues on them that just embed themselves into you in like 100 little tiny slivers all at once. No matter what you're doing, wash the seed. There can be traces of there can be insects, there can be pathogen. You're just going to decrease the likelihood of disappointment by washing your seed.
So you crack it open and then do that, or you just...
No, I just did that to see if the patch that I was drawing from was viable.
Do you cut off the wing and then wash them, or what do you?
Nope.
How do you wash them?
Nope.
You just throw it in
Just
water?
as is. I would remove them. I'd strip them off the stem like so. Throw them all in a colander or a sieve and give them a rinse, just with kind of the shower feature on the faucet. Give them a good rinse, and then they go straight into a bag with vermiculite, moist vermiculite. Stratification is we're trying to imitate a period of dormancy through heat or cold generally. Scarification, we would be imitating a seed like passing through a bird's gut and the acids in it breaking down that thick outer or hard casing to break the seed out of dormancy. So one way is using a mild acid, sometimes stronger acids for a fixed period of time. That's like a little more advanced level than what we're talking about, but that's where I turn to the books. You get vermiculite wherever. Not too wet, not too dry. If you're dealing with serious pathogen potential, I'd say clean media, brand new bag, and as soon as you're done with that batch, both of those exit the system if there's a major pathogen risk. In general, I just rinse the bags. Generally, I'll repurpose the vermiculite for other needs as long as there's a low chance of pathogen spread. But yeah, I try and minimize the waste I produce. If I saw disease transmission, then yeah, quarantine time and change the strategy, but something we need to be observing, absolutely. Okay, moist vermiculite label. You'll see some of the bags we'll be using today will have multiple labels. Every year I just keep using the same bags, I rinse them out. Pacific, dogwood, and the year that I collected the seed, not the year that it started growing. So 2023. I'll grab, this has already been pre-rinsed. And I'm gonna, as I mentioned before, I'm gonna hedge my bets and try a couple of different techniques. One of which will be the vermiculite cold stratification method. So give it a little shake, mix it all together. I do not seal the bag. I like air exchange to happen in the fridge. But I do need to check back because this will dry out in the fridge. I never want it to dry out completely. So check back. And what I'm gonna be looking for is I do periodic fridge checks, and you're just looking for an emerging sprout, root radical or cotyledon, one or the other.
So once a week check kind of thing?
Generally, nothing's happening until mid to late December.
Okay.
So you can just chuck it to the back and forget till about that point. The earliest you're gonna see is the oaks, but generally I'm potting the oaks in December anyways. I don't want root radicals that are too long because they are very delicate and tend to break. So I'll try and pot those up in November or December. They're just going in the fridge really for storage, not for stratification. Just to be clear, these need stratification. And generally they will sprout in the fridge. And when I see the sprouts, I pull them out. Whatever have sprouted, I'll pot those up, wait for more to come. So just keep checking after that because they'll be coming every couple of days. It's like Christmas every time. If you had them in a mulch pile right now, they'd probably already have quite a bit of extension and maybe close to getting to the soil. Whereas in the fridge, it slows everything down. Seems to anyway. Laura, we didn't talk about cones at all. You want to?
Yeah, well, this is just me experimenting. So these were shore pines from some of my hikes, and often the shore pines, the cones they're closed because if they're already open, then the seeds have often dropped out. I've brought them in the house and then put them in the sun where they get more heat. Like often I get closed ones off a part of the tree that was in the shade, and then bring them in, and then they'll open up and they'll come out. But I did that this year and none were really opening up very much, so I've been trying to kind of cut parts of it and pick them out. And then with the shore pine, the seeds are just like this papery thing. That just has a little seed attached to the papery part. And I've found, because often I pull them all apart, I'm like, where's the seeds? And they're so small, they're hard to find. But they will float because of that little papery part. So that's what I've usually done with the shore pines, is just like try to get them to open in a hot spot. If they don't, then just start pulling it apart and then put them in some water and find the ones that have floated. Otherwise, if you find, sometimes even this time of year or a little bit later, so you can just go underneath the shore pine and then you'll see they've opened and they'll just be scattered on the ground, the seeds. And yeah, I found them, I could just germinate them even like in a moist paper towel on top of the fridge. They germinate really easily like that, and then I just pot them up. Or I've done cold stratification too, what he just showed you, for like 1 to 2 months, and then put outside, and then they germinated in the bags outside. Like, not all the things like he's shown, not everything will germinate in the fridge. Like, so often you're just doing that cold stratification period, but then you put it outside for a warm period, and then they'll germinate outside. And so these I started, I collected last season, and then I think both these I did cold strut, but some I just did on top of the fridge. And these are shore plants from Highlands.
I've got a Douglas fir cone here, and I just wanted to show, I peeled back the bracts basically to expose the seed inside. You can see the two are just hidden there. There's two little seeds.
Tiny.
And when the conditions are right, they'll pop out off of that and drift away in the wind. See them hiding down in there? So if I just tapped it on the counter, they'd probably pop out. And I've got a bunch of Western red cedar here too, which is a much smaller cone. See this little one? And I've got the seed from it, which if you just grab a bunch of these and tap them on a table like this, I use a jar, like a mason jar, put the lid on and shake the heck out of it. And then all the tiny little seed will just pop out. Now the strategy for Western red cedar and Douglas fir and many conifers, cold stratification works really well. And then pot them up. They generally like to be a bit more below the surface than oaks, but occasionally, like I find them in my containers all over, like just naturally germinating on their own, so they clearly do germinate well on the surface. So you could experiment with that. January, you could pot them up and stick them outdoors. More soil volume is better for Douglas fir especially. Western red cedar seem to do okay in 1 gallon containers. I don't grow many of them, and I would love to experiment in growing them in the larger air pots to get a nice fibrous root system formed for planting out. I think it's important that we do continue to introduce young red cedars and not just abandon them. I think the most popular theory is that the whole range is just very vulnerable to climate change. If there's like a compositional issue, like Beacon Hill Park is one I think of, there's those huge Western red cedars in behind Cameron Bandshell. They're all about the same age, and there's no age differential in there. So that would be an excellent place to start planting Western red cedar. These are difficult decisions that are going to have to be made by decision makers, I think. With Western red cedar in particular, we have to be careful not to lean too much on Western science, which is going to say like they're not going to be viable. It's just like the erasure of indigenous knowledge is a continuation of colonial practices in forest planning in general. We have to be really cautious not to lean in too hard on that, because there are many cases where we do see Western cedar doing just fine. But it may be more expedient as an urban forest planner to just say we're not going to plant Western red cedar anymore, right? So it's a very difficult dilemma we find ourselves in. There are many people that have produced like actual lists, like recommended species lists. There's a recommended species list for climate change adaptation in an urban forest context. Garry oaks do very well, open grown. Coastal Douglas fir is looking vulnerable in the next 20 years, they're saying, so just be aware of that. You may want to lean more on where there is an existing stand rather than planting an open grown tree. Potting spoon that I made, and I really like the profile, and it's quite, rot resistant. Cedar's even lighter, but less hard, a little bit softer. But you can just carve your own garden tools, save yourself some more plastic getting into the landfill. And this is just a piece of Western red cedar that I use for actually getting the air space out of the side of the containers when I'm potting up. I bought in bulk. I'm trying to get away from peat, and I'm trying to get away from plastic. They're removing bogs and depleting those ecosystems, and they store immense amounts of carbon, right?
Yeah, I've used coconut coir quite a bit, which, still it's being shipped probably from India or wherever, but kind of justified that to myself, being like, well, the ship's coming anyways, I don't know. And often you can get it, it's minimal packaging and it's super compressed, and then it can bulk up, but it is a bit challenging. It dries out on the top pretty quickly, and it takes, I've had success with it, but it takes a little bit of just getting to know it and looking at how your plants are responding.
If we're talking about switching over to container growing, like seed starting and container growing are kind of two different worlds. I often started with like these perlite peat blends for starting, and then would switch over to like a sandy soil. I think with the coconut coir, it's more about the starting stage. Use the regular soil that already exists. Almost every time, yeah. Unless there's an indication looking at the other trees that are on site, if like things look really terrible, that might be a starting point where I would look at a soil analysis. Maybe there's an issue in the soil, like nutrient depleted or just very droughty or has become hydrophobic. That could be an issue, but generally we try and use the soil that we have.
On the site where you found it. Yeah.
On the site where you found it.
So not just like soil from our garden.
Yeah, I don't encourage you to remove and replace soil ever if it's already present. Trees are pretty adaptable, especially the ones, if you're doing those checks from public urban trees, looking at the health, especially from similar growing conditions to where you're going to be ultimately planting it out, there's a good chance you're going to do okay. You'll notice that I haven't got any fertilizer here. Generally, when you're establishing trees, they have everything they need in the seed casing and carry it quite a ways along before they start drawing on nutrients within the soil that you placed them in. I don't fertilize my plants in the first year, basically. End of first growing season would be the earliest that I would fertilize any of the trees I'm growing. So bone meal, any of that business, I don't do. Like if I was live staking, for example, a cottonwood or a dogwood, no rooting hormone necessary. It'll root just fine on its own. Willow as well, stick it in the ground. Don't do it in the dead of summer, I would say, but anytime in the dormant season, live staking that certain group of species, no rooting hormone required. It may improve the results, but I haven't had many failures either. Okay, I'm gonna show you how to build one pot, and I'll go start to finish. I'll pot up an oak here just so you can see what it looks like. So I've got the outside of my 1 gallon air pruning pot. So the blisters and holes face out. I'm gonna grab one of the bottoms here. It says this side down. Put it on the first row, and I'm gonna wrap it up so those dimples connect with each other. Take 2 of these screws, one in the bottom and one in the top. We have assembled our container. Okay. So container growing, we're gonna end up with air pockets in the sides. Just do 1 round along the side to start, give it a little bounce. Take my acorn, double check its quality. It looks like a great acorn. Remember which side the radical will emerge from? Is it the pointy side or the flat side? There we go. Everybody wins. And just a little skim to finish it off. And the finishing touch is a little bit of mulch. Got some rodent protection, guaranteed to reduce disappointment.
Dig them up and plant them though too.
Yeah. So generally I will mold these. Just be careful, they're super sharp. This is complete. So we've got our soil in our container, bit of oak mulch, which is pre-moist. Soil's a little bit moist, but I'll probably want to water it later. And the rodent protection. Don't forget to put a tag with a label, what the species is and what year.
I like to rate on my bags like where I collected it. So like with this, I'd say Highlands, the June Plum, I'd say South Saanich.
With the arbutus, what I do is I squish them. I tend to get, because they will...
I'm breaking them open.
Yeah, that's exactly. Because otherwise, they start to dry out and the fleshy fruit on the outside hardens up, and it's like the seeds can't burst through it. Bye. See you soon.